This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoyed the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And I want to give a special thank you to James Gunther, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Alright, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 383 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Kat Rosenfield. She's the author of the young adult novels Amelia Ann is Dead and Gone and Inland. And she's also covered controversies in YA publishing in her Vulture articles, The Toxic Drama on YA Twitter, and the latest YA Twitter pile-on forces a rising star to self-cancel. And we'll be speaking with her today about her new novel, A Trick of Light, which she wrote together with Luke Lieberman, Ryan Silbert, and Stan Lee, the legendary Marvel Comics editor who co-created such iconic superheroes as Spider-Man, the Avengers, and the X-Men. And now here's her interview with Kat Rosenfield. All right, so we're here with Kat Rosenfield. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so you said in an interview that you grew up in cow country, so tell us about that.
Cow country. I'm from Coxsackie, New York, which is spelled in a way that makes people think it's pronounced in a way other than what it is. I'm not going to say it out loud because it's kind of gross. But yeah, I'm from a really small town, lots of cows and prisons, and that's pretty much all we've got. Bucolic, but it was a very rural upbringing.
So did that influence you in your imaginative, creative life?
For sure. I spent a lot of time kind of playing by myself outside, in the woods, imagining, creatures living there or whatever. And then my first novel, actually, I drew upon not so much the landscape, but what it's like to grow up in a really small insular community where people have known each other a long time, have been related to each other for a long time, to kind of capture that dynamic in this murder mystery.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a little bit. But so I also heard you say that you weren't allowed to watch any TV growing up?
It's a little bit more complicated than that. I wasn't allowed to watch anything that my parents felt was unintellectual, and the way they defined that was really kind of slippery. I'm not entirely sure how they kind of made up their rules. I now suspect, actually, that they were just limiting me to watching things that they themselves were interested in watching. So I was allowed to watch The X-Files, but not any sitcoms. I've never seen a single episode of Friends, which I think makes me very weird for a person my age.
So even when you're a young kid, you had to watch, what kind of intellectual stuff is there for
oh, gosh. I watched a lot of The Electric Company in Sesame Street when I was a little kid. And then the show that I remember being on most when I was a little bit older was Masterpiece Mystery, which I remember mostly because it had this Edward Gorey animated opening sequence with a woman on a gravestone kind of crying in the rain. So that was definitely on in my house. And when I was a kid, there were a couple of things like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, for some reason, kind of fit the bill. They passed the test. I was allowed to watch that show. I was allowed to watch Ren and Stimpy because my dad was a huge fan of it. So yeah, a little esoteric.
Were your parents intellectuals or professors or journalists or something?
My dad's a doctor, and my mom was a housewife with a master's in public health that she didn't end up using. So I would say they were, intellectual people, but not necessarily neither one of them were in, professorial roles.
Mm. But they encouraged you to read a lot, or I guess, because there were so few TV shows you could watch, you read a lot?
Yeah. I loved to read, and I was encouraged to read anything I wanted. No limits on that. If it was in print, I was allowed, which is how I ended up coming into contact with some pretty inappropriate stuff as I was, around the ages of 10 to 12. The story that I always tell is that I was casting about for something new to read because I had consumed everything available to me that was age appropriate. And my mom pulled The Shining off of our bookshelf and handed it to me. Was like, here, do this. I was 11. And that book messed me up. I was like afraid of our bathtub for the next 8 to 10 years.
So was it any of the stuff that you were reading fantasy or science fiction related?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I read everything. Growing up, I loved The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I loved The Hobbit. And then I also really got a kick out of kind of these, I'm trying to think of how to describe them. These sort of overwrought young adult novels that always featured teenagers dying of some kind of horrible disease or cancer or a heart defect. They were by this woman named Lurleen McDaniel. And they were just like soap operas about dying adolescents. So I was really into those too.
Mm. And so when did you start thinking that you might want to write your own fiction?
It took me a while actually to come around to the idea of writing a book myself. I had sort of dabbled in like writing short stories when I was growing up, because we would be assigned them in school. And I always liked doing it, but I sort of got away from the idea of writing as something that I would do, for fun, let alone for profit, until I was out in the working world in my mid-20s and realized that I was very bored. So I started blogging at that point and sort of rediscovered that writing was something I really enjoyed and came easily to me. And that was when I started thinking that I might be interested in writing a book.
So what sort of blogging were you doing?
It was sort of the golden age of blogging. This would have been like circa 2004, 2005, when everyone just had a personal blog that was like, I mean, it could be anything. It could be like a diary / political commentary / here's something funny I saw on the street and I want to talk about it. I wrote a lot of things that I guess would now sort of maybe fit into, they were sort of somewhere between personal essays and tweets in terms of the tone. I was really trying to mimic the sort of Sloane Crosley style of personal essay writing where it was funny and intimate and, you felt like you knew the person, but you were also entertained. You felt like their life was interesting. That was my entry point.
So did you start getting paid first for nonfiction or for fiction?
Let's see. I sort of fell into blogging for a few different sites. Once I decided I wanted to start pursuing writing as a career, I started applying for things on Media Bistro freelance. And I ended up as a writer for this site called SparkNotes, which had a designated blog. Those are like the study guides that, I guess are sort of the current generation's version of Cliff's Notes. But they had a lifestyle blog where you would write about high school related topics, usually from a humorous standpoint. So I started doing that. And I also stumbled into a gig writing for one of MTV's blog verticals called Hollywood Crush. Long since defunct. It was the Young Hollywood Gossip blog. So I was sort of situated in this like youth culture-centric, digital, gossipy Hollywood entertainment space. And after I'd been doing that for a while, I ended up segueing into a reporting position at MTV News. When the blogs folded, they brought me over to the main news site. And that was when I really started working in journalism, started getting paid to write. And about the same time, I sold my first novel. So I was sort of trying a lot of different things, throwing stuff at the wall, seeing what would stick.
And what was the process like of selling that first novel?
I did it a little backwards. I had worked in publishing when I first got out of college, and my husband, who I met at work, still worked in publishing at the time that I'd finished this book. So he took the manuscript from me without me knowing that he was doing this. He took it and he showed it to an editor who liked it and decided that she wanted to buy it. So I ended up having a book deal before I had an agent. or anything like that. So the process was overall kind of sneaky and surprising, but ultimately was a good thing.
And it was published as YA, right? The first novel?
Yeah. That was something that I sort of fell into. At the time, it was, and it still is a sort of a wide open category. What qualifies a book as YA is not the most scientific process to determine it. It's basically, at the time, it was if the main character was a teenager who was still in high school or recently in high school, then it was a YA book. And so that was where I ended up.
So you just wrote it, and you hadn't given any thought to how it would be marketed or anything?
No, I was just trying something. I wasn't even sure that it was such a weird, sort of dark story. I mean, despite having a teenage protagonist, it's quite adult in a lot of ways and deals with, complicated subject matter. So I wasn't really sure that anybody was going to want to publish it.
Were you friends with any other writers or involved in any online communities for writers or things like that?
Online communities, no, not really. I mean, I got to know other writers as a freelancer for these different websites.
But you didn't know any other like novelists at that time?
No, not really. I mean, I'd worked with a few when I was still a book publicist, but no, it was not really part of certainly not part of my social life at that point.
So then what was it like having the book come out?
It's exciting. I mean, it was a while ago at this point. I mean, that was 2012, so, 7 years. And I mean, publishing a book, it's like, it's very exciting when you first get the deal, and then you get to see your cover, and there's all this stuff that happens ramping up to the actual release. And then it comes out, and sometimes that's actually the most anticlimactic part. Because it's just, it's already existed in your mind and in your heart, and even in the form of a bound book, for at least a couple months before it actually hits shelves. So that's sort of the last part of the process to happen. And
you said it was sort of about your hometown in a way, or?
The setting was based on my hometown. I plugged in a couple of little pieces of sort of local lore. And I inadvertently named a character after somebody who used to bully me in high school because I used it as a placeholder and then forgot to change it before publication. So that was a mistake, but he's in there.
Did anybody ever comment on that, or?
No, I don't. I certainly don't think he read that book or any book.
Yeah.
So I think I was safe there. Although now that I'm talking about it on a podcast with a lot of listeners, who knows?
You're assuming we have a lot of listeners.
I don't know. I kind of got the impression that this was a big deal. You seemed like kind of a big deal.
Oh, well, no, I hope so. But so nobody from your town was like, oh, come on, our town's not really that dark or anything like that?
Oh, no, nothing like that. I don't think that anybody, and I'm glad of this, I don't think anybody took it particularly personally. It was clearly that I sort of started there and then spun out into something that was imaginary. So the people who read the book who knew that I had sort of started with Cooksaki, I think were mostly just entertained by the idea of the town having that kind of role in somebody's creative life, and that somebody from the town would have a creative life. There's not a whole lot of writers coming out of where I'm from. So.
But so that went well enough that you're like, oh, that was fun. Let me do it again.
I kind of felt at that point like there was not a whole lot else to do. I continued to freelance, but writing is really the only thing that I'm particularly good at. So that was where I decided to, the basket I decided to put my eggs in, I guess.
And then what was the second novel?
That was called Inland, and it was a sort of a psychological thriller about a young woman with a mysterious and possibly insidious connection to the sea.
Is that a fantasy novel in any way? Or is that a spoiler?
I guess it's got fantastic elements. It's got an open ending that I wouldn't want to spoil if anybody 5 years after publication still wants to read it. But it had fantastic elements. That book was, I started thinking about it at the time that Twilight had become a really big deal, and everyone was trying to figure out what the next big thing was going to be. And in all the sort of YA musings on future trends, somebody said, well, since we've already done vampires and we've done werewolves, the next big thing is going to be mermaids. And I thought, well, that's dumb. I don't want to write a mermaid book. That's ridiculous. And then I started thinking, well, like, if I had to write a mermaid book, if someone put a gun to my head and said, write a mermaid book right now, what would it be? And from there, I started noodling on this idea of sort of a darker twist on different mermaid lore, and specifically Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid. And I came up with something that was interesting enough to me that I decided to write it after all. So I kind of owned myself there, I guess.
And so you were at some level kind of connected to the YA worlds, or aware of what was going on, or just peripherally, or?
Yeah. I mean, once you've published in YA, and especially at that point, it was a big thing to make sure that you were on Twitter, make sure you were accessible to your fans. YA readers hang out online, and they're a passionate bunch. They make fan art, they make playlists, and so if you're there in those spaces, you can connect with them. But that was certainly a space that I was hanging out in and observing trends in, starting around the time that my first book was published.
So did it seem like fun at the time, or were there any like harbingers of doom even back then?
I think I know what you're getting at. So, I mean, I think that initially it was fun, and it's funny. I've gone back from time to time and looked at some of the old conversations that were happening in that space, and it was just, the mood was different. In 2012, 2013, it was all like book giveaways and people sharing gift sets and art and just talking about craft and doing fun Q&As. So at the start, I think maybe this is true of Twitter at large, not just in the YA space. It was just a sort of a more positive and a more freewheeling community. Then things started to shift in a way that I think has been observable kind of across the board on Twitter. Certain dynamics emerge as dominant that are maybe a little more toxic. Particularly in spaces where there's also a really dominant kind of a political bent, which did become true in the YA space.
Right. And so I want to come back to that. But before we get to that, let's talk about your sort of third book that was a collaborative novel, Trick of Light. So what was sort of the first inkling you had that Trick of Light was going to be a thing?
Oh gosh, it was actually a huge surprise. So A Trick of Light, I should back this up to the point before I came on board, started with Luke Lieberman and Stan Lee. Stan had been a mentor to Luke since Luke's years as a film student at NYU, and they had always wanted to collaborate together on something. They weren't sure what, and maybe. When Luke and Stan first met, they had talked about the internet, and Stan felt like the internet held a lot of promise, and it was, this incredible tool that was going to globalize us and connect communities and make all kinds of exciting collaboration and communication possible. And fast forward about 10 years when they returned to the idea of collaborating, and Stan felt that the internet had not necessarily lived up to its promise. Instead of connecting people, it was having the effect of tribalizing them. People, even though they could get online and talk to someone anywhere in the world, a lot of us felt more isolated and more alone than ever. So kind of stemming from this question of what the internet was doing to human beings, to our connections with each other, to even our sense of reality and identity, the two of them started world building. They brought on Ryan Silbert, a filmmaker, to collaborate on that process. And then eventually, once they had this premise in place, it was decided that it was going to be an Audible original to begin with. You're going to do this in audio, for audio specifically. And that was when I came on board. And at the time, all I knew about the project was that it was this really, really cool thing that my agent had been involved with. We all share an agent, and she said that she wanted to put me up for it. And I was convinced that I was not geeky enough by far. That terrible, terrible case of impostor syndrome as I was having conversations, exploring the possibility of becoming a contributor or collaborator on this project. So nobody was more surprised than me when it turned out to be an amazing fit. But luckily they decided they wanted to go in a little bit of a different direction to get somebody from more of a literary fiction background because, I think the guys felt like they already were representing the truly hardcore nerdy side. So it was cool to diversify things a little bit.
Mm-hmm. I mean, do you think that the fact that it's a book about teenage characters and the fact, I think you had done a teen advice column. Do you think that played any role in them selecting you?
I think, what I understand is that they were looking for somebody who could really tap into who these characters were and what their relationships were like with each other. Stan was really intent on, and always had been, but I think especially in this project, was intent that this was a character-driven story, that it was important that these characters be fully realized on the page, that the readers relate to them. And 10 years as a teen advice columnist, I definitely did have an insight or two into kind of the workings of the teenage brain. So I'm sure that helped.
Mm-hmm. I heard you say in a podcast too that women oftentimes won't really aggressively pursue these sorts of opportunities and that you really went for it. Is there anything more to say about that?
It's, that whole question of imposter syndrome, I think that does affect women maybe more often than men, or maybe we're just told that it does and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But I think that the thing that I was sort of getting at in the podcast that you're talking about was the idea that women are always apologizing for taking up space. And it's not just about getting a project, but then about aggressively promoting it or thinking that you have the right to be in this space telling this story, instead of somebody else. That I think that women struggle with that. And unfortunately, I think that there are a lot of people out there who are aware of that and who kind of prey upon it to tell women that they shouldn't be taking up space. And even sometimes it's other women doing it. So in terms of that, having that confidence, to just be a working writer and to feel like you deserve to be there. I don't know if I would say that was key to me getting this work, but at the same time, there was a point where I thought to myself, like, if you weren't right for this opportunity, it wouldn't be presenting itself in this way. I thought, yes, it's new, but I can do this. And so there was definitely a point where I sort of psyched myself up, to not worry about any doubts related to my ability to tackle this kind of new subject matter and a new kind of writing process because it was my first time collaborating with somebody on a book. And to just say, yeah, I want this. It's cool. I want to do this and I'm going to do this.
And the process was basically that the four of you kind of outlined the book together and then you wrote the actual text. Is that right?
Yeah, Stan was really heavily involved all the way through. We were lucky to complete this project while he was still with us. So the story was a collaborative effort. And we did come up with the most detailed outline that I have ever seen for anything that I've ever worked on. Just like beat by beat, line by line, how people were relating to each other, what they were saying to each other, what was happening in a scene. So in that sense, even though I was technically I'm the one whose name is on the cover along with Stan, it really was storytelling as a team sport.
Mm. What was it like meeting Stan Lee for the first time? Were you really nervous or excited?
Oh, God. I mean, it's impossible to be in a creative space with Stan, to be collaborating with him and not to be nervous, but also excited, and so excited because he's excited. He had the most unbelievable creative enthusiasm, and he was an incredibly spontaneously creative person. He was, having ideas in, well into his 90s. So yeah, I mean, it's basically, there's certainly this moment where you're just having like a fangirl freak out. And then you realize that Stan himself is a super fan of so many things. And that's sort of what makes him such a great collaborator and such a fun storyteller.
Are there any particular moments or conversations or anything that stick out in your mind?
Actually, the thing that I kind of keep coming back to, and this is something that happened after he passed away, was that there was always this dichotomy between, working with Stan, the human being, the storyteller, and Stan, the larger than life icon who, you'd go to a movie theater and he would be there on screen, like enormous. It was like working with the Wizard of Oz. And, sometimes you get the glimpse behind the curtain, and then sometimes there would be this big floating head. And, so, the day that he passed away, I was feeling just unbelievably sad about it because, having worked on this story, everyone was so excited to have him with us when it came into the world. We really wanted him here, to be part of the release, to put the book in his hands, say, look what we made. So I was feeling really down, and my husband suggested that we watch a Marvel movie together because it would cheer me up and, it would be a nice way to honor Stan. And I said, okay. We decided on Guardians of the Galaxy 2 because that's a fun one, and I didn't want to be, kind of like weeping my way through this. And so we're watching it, and it, definitely a super fun movie, but I had forgotten that Stan had this mid-credits scene where he's alone in a spacesuit on this barren planet, and these gentlemen who were supposed to give him a ride home are all leaving him behind because he's, been talking obnoxiously and they're tired of it. And as they're leaving him, he says, in that voice, like, oh, geez, guys, come back. I got so many more stories to tell. And I was just like ugly crying, not prepared because he really, he did have so many stories to tell. And the thing that really, I think, was brought home to me in that moment was that I and Luke and Ryan and really all of the creators who became a part of his stories, particularly the ones that were being brought to life in his, his last years. We all have this privilege, but also this responsibility to make sure they keep going because there are still all of these stories. There's so much work that hasn't seen the light of day yet. And it's, we have now the responsibility to bring it forward and carry on and, keep it going.
So you said that you sort of had this imposter syndrome around not feeling like you were enough of a sci-fi fan or comic book geek or anything. Do you feel like, having worked on this book, that you've gotten drawn into that world a lot more?
Well, I experienced my first and second Comic-Cons within the past year. So, talk about your trial by fire. I think that I am far geekier now than I was at the start of 2019, for sure. And yeah, I mean, it's a world that I really, I was aware of but had never spent time in, and it's been incredibly exciting and cool to see. Just the amount of energy there is amazing.
Well, did they put you on panels at Comic-Con?
Yeah. We all did a panel together. We did one in San Diego with Yara Shahidi, who was the wonderful reader for the Audible original. And then in New York, it was the three of us, to talk about the print edition and, what was new and different and exciting about that coming forward.
Mm-hmm. So what sort of, were people in the audience asking you questions and stuff?
Yeah. I mean, in New York, it was interesting. The questions were very centered on people who were storytellers themselves and wanted to kind of find out about what our process was like and, asking questions about craft. And I think somebody asked, what's the weirdest thing in Stan Lee's house or the coolest thing in Stan Lee's house? Which, the obvious answer was Stan. Stan is the coolest thing in Stan Lee's house. In San Diego. What's the second
weirdest thing in Stan Lee's house?
Oh, God. I don't know. I don't think that I could.
I actually don't know that I really have any idea what Stan Lee's house looks like. Like, what could you describe?
No, I haven't. I haven't been there.
Oh, all right.
Yeah. And then in San Diego, we had, because we had a literal celebrity with us, lots and lots of questions for Yara about, whose computer she would want to hack with her brain if she could. And so, that was fun, kind of engaging more with the substance of A Trick of Light, which is, it's a fun yarn. So it was great to talk about that.
Yeah, I don't know how much you want to say about the sort of giveaway about the plot of the book, but the basic premise is that there's a teenage character who develops a superpower that involves the internet. I don't know, is there more you want to say about?
Yeah, I think that we can, it's at this point, I can comfortably say that Cameron, one of our two protagonists, suffers an accident that endows him with cyberkinetic abilities. He can communicate with software with his mind. And he makes a connection with a young woman named Nia, who also has incredible gifts. She's a gifted hacker, also has a mysterious past. And together, their connection is something really powerful. And, the kind of log line is they could save the world together or they could destroy it.
Mm-hmm. And they meet while playing video games, which just made me curious if you're a gamer yourself.
I'm not. I spent a lot of time watching people on YouTube playing Fortnite, playing Call of Duty to, just lots and lots of these, people who video their own gameplay. And I was so grateful to them. It's a really interesting world that I had never experienced before.
Mm-hmm. And how about there's a biohacking convention that features prominently in the book. Is that a real thing, like biohacking conventions? And did you ever go to anything like that?
Biohacking is a real thing. I did not attend any conventions. I would have loved to if there was one available in the time frame within which I was writing this, but it didn't end up working out. But it was a fun thing to find out what is already possible, which is a lot. And then to imagine what could become possible in the near future with a little bit more technology.
Mm-hmm. Is there any biohacks that you might be interested in yourself?
I think about this all the time. And I don't know. I actually, when I think about things like you could get an implant, that would allow you to scan yourself through airport security or to pay for your coffee in the morning without having to take out a wallet or all of this stuff. And I am so torn between the convenience of that because I'm always forgetting stuff at home and it would make my life a lot easier. But do I want that inside my body? It's such a conundrum. And I think, it's something that we're already kind of reckoning with in terms of how much of your data do you want to give to Google or to Apple? Do you want to give them your fingerprint? Do you want to give them your face to bring into their kind of biometric unlocking mechanism? Do you want to give your DNA to a company that can tell you where you come from, but might also later catch you doing a murder or somebody related to you doing a murder. So yeah, I think that there are questions there that I find interesting and concerning that I have not yet figured out the answers to.
Mm-hmm. And so you said one of the themes of the book is sort of that the internet was supposed to bring us together, but it's ended up kind of making us more angry and isolated. And you said that was sort of the premise from the beginning, but I feel like you have a lot of experience with that. Did you come in and say, like, guys, the internet's actually way worse than you think, or did they fully comprehend how bad it was even before you got involved?
Oh, I mean, I think that, the impact of social media, particularly on the way that we interact with each other, is something that's so much part of everybody's contemporary anxieties at this point. Everyone who has to live and work on the internet has experienced this to some degree. Even just the kind of casual dehumanization that happens when you're interacting with somebody with a screen as an intermediary, so much gets lost. So, in terms of, convincing my collaborators that the internet has this dark side, that wasn't a difficult thing to do. The thing that they didn't initially believe was some of the conspiracy theories that proliferate in dark but not that dark corners of the internet. We were trying to come up with some sort of imaginary conspiracy theories for somebody to be involved with, and I had provided a few examples, and they said, these are too out there, it's too ridiculous. And I said, oh, no. And I think I sent them the clip of Alex Jones yelling about how chemicals are turning all of the frogs gay. So yeah, that was a little educational moment.
Well, right. So let's come back then to the YA Twitter stuff. So you wrote this article on Vulture called "The Toxic Drama on YA Twitter," and I don't want to rehash all the details of it. People can go read that article if they're interested. But I'm just curious about what your personal experience with all this stuff has been. So, like, how did you what was the process of deciding to write about that topic?
So, as we had talked about before, I was already in that space, and I think that the phenomenon that I was observing there is actually something that's been happening in a lot of left-wing spaces. But because YA was sort of where I had my window, I did start to notice around 2015, 2016, that the conversation in YA had shifted in this interesting and sometimes sort of troubling way when it came to how we were tackling issues of free expression. And it culminated, I think this was towards the end of 2016, with a book that was still in the ARC stage, so it had not been read by very many people, was denounced by one influential blogger and also YA author on Twitter, and it turned into this just dumpster fire of people, frantically kind of wanting to signal that they were right thinking about this. The novel was accused of being racist, and again, this was something that it was difficult to know how much validity there were to these claims because the novel was not widely available. Only a handful of people had read it. So you had people, sight unseen, going on Goodreads to vote down this book, give it 1 star, to try to, torpedo the buzz for it. And the thing that really was strange to me was that a petition started circulating amongst a writers group on Facebook where people were saying, let's petition HarperCollins to pull this book for edits, to force edits upon this other writer. And it was even in the language of this discussion, it was, what we really want is for this book to be canceled, but saying that we want it pulled for edits will play better. So, I made what I now realize was the incredibly stupid mistake of, registering my alarm that this was happening in a creative space, that we had people trying to campaign to censor the work of a fellow writer. I thought that was shocking.
This is, you tweeted something?
I tweeted something. I mean, I didn't tag anybody or hashtag it. I just, I guess, I subtweeted about it. I said, it's crazy to see people arguing for what's essentially book banning in the name of social justice. And a horde of very angry people descended into my notifications and called me all kinds of names. And my first thought after I got over just the kind of horror, of what was happening was, God, this is interesting. Something interesting is happening here. So that was where I started paying a lot closer attention to this particular dynamic. And I discovered that it was happening everywhere, and it was having a real impact on people who were trying to still work in this space, and on young readers themselves who were being shamed and intimidated out of even saying they wanted to read a book once it had been deemed controversial or problematic. You had adults, adult authors going after them, telling them that they were basically Nazis for wanting to make up their own minds about something that they'd been told was bad.
Did you have any sense at this point that this might affect your career, getting into this controversy?
I didn't. And I had somebody, one of the sort of most influential parties in the YA space started a really professionally damaging rumor about me that was completely false, in retaliation, I assume, for having just, said anything about this issue at all. And, I honestly, I was shocked at the time, and it's still kind of surprising to me that, adults who have families and hold down jobs and, are just like normal functioning people, behave this way, behave so vindictively, and kind of with such malicious glee when it comes to identifying a target who they want to destroy by any means necessary. So, after that happened, I definitely did have a sense that writing about this would be potentially, it would make me like an enfant terrible as far as the YA community was concerned, or I'd be a bug to them. But I also felt like I didn't have a whole lot to lose at that point.
Right. And so you wrote this article on Vulture, and one thing that really struck me is you said that nobody that you quoted in the article was willing to go on the record, because they were all so afraid on both sides, of the blowback.
Yeah, one person, Francina Simone, bless her, very brave. And she has her own book coming out this year. So, she survived speaking out about this unscathed. But everybody else was terrified. And that was the thing that was sort of most identifiable. It was the fear, that people, felt like there was no room to speak up. There was no room to misstep. Or even to just, dissent in an ethical way, that people were completely petrified of being the next target. And even this young woman who really, was on the side of the people who wanted to kind of take these books off shelves and, or force edits on their authors, she felt that she couldn't use her name talking to me because her friends would see it as a huge, betrayal that she'd even, engaged with me at all.
Right. I mean, I'm only very peripherally involved with YA, fantasy, and science fiction, but just looking at it from the outside, it just seems so dysfunctional. And, I just recently moved from New York City, so I socialized with a lot of writers and editors and agents and stuff. And there was a conversation I had, I don't know, a couple months ago where a writer said, I'm almost afraid to get a good idea for a YA book because I don't know if I want to write it. And the agent said flatly, just don't write YA. It's just not even worth it. And that really struck me a bit,
Wow,
something's
yeah.
gone really, really wrong here.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny that is the kind of thing that I've heard myself. And, I don't know why it is that YA ends up being ground zero for so much of this stuff, except that maybe the fact that there's this young readership has always made it a little bit of a magnet for controversy. But yeah, that's interesting to hear.
Mm-hmm. I sort of have the vague sense that the YA boom has sort of cooled down and the books aren't selling the way that they used to. And I don't know, assuming that's true, I mean, there's probably a lot of reasons for that, but I can't help but wondering if all the nastiness online is just turning away a lot of people, both writers and readers.
I wonder, yeah. I mean, certainly there's evidence that the category itself is contracting, that, people are not reading as much of it as they used to. And I think that actual teenagers are less interested in a lot of the books that are driving the conversations in YA. What you have is a situation where half of the readers of YA, at least, are actually adults, and not necessarily young adults, who are kind of coming into this space and imposing their tastes or their particular anxieties on the conversation overall in a way that I think, honestly, really annoys actual teenagers, who just don't want any part of all of this drama. So the category itself has changed, trying to accommodate the demands of this very vocal group of not necessarily young adult readers who still read YA. And I mean, I don't know if maybe that has something to do with why the category has changed so much, why what's available has changed so much. I mean, it's certainly been a long time since we had a Twilight or a Hunger Games, which were, the books that really exploded the category to begin with.
What would you say is your current relationship to YA? Like, are you not involved with it anymore, or do you think you might write anymore? Why?
Yeah, it's like, picture somebody very slowly and gingerly backing away from a mire of like sticky black mud full of screaming people who are all flinging the mud at each other. That might about sum up my relationship with YA. I mean, I did for a long time, because I was writing about it. I kind of hovered near the fringes of these conversations and was fascinated often by how incredibly toxic it was. But there's a point at which watching this stuff happen and watching it play out over and over and never get any better becomes a little bit discouraging.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll say too, I mean, my sense of it is that YA is the most dysfunctional, but a lot of the same problems exist in adult fantasy and science fiction. And I've talked to any number of writers who are, I mean, top rank, award-winning, amazingly talented writers who said, that they're taking the same approach that you are, of just sort of quietly withdrawing because of all the toxicity, and they just sort of avoid conventions and avoid other writers and stuff because of all the online bullying and everything.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. And I think it's unfortunate because the people who actually enjoy living this way, I think, are such a tiny minority. They just happen to be really loud and really scary. And, people would prefer to avoid them than, get covered in mud themselves. So it's not a surprise that people are just kind of disengaging and going to have these discussions somewhere else. But I think it's a shame.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I heard you say that I thought was really interesting was that, you were talking about Laurie Forrest, the author of The Black Witch, and you said that that she never really had an enormous number of personal or professional connections to people who were sort of involved in all these online controversies. And so she could just kind of ignore it and sort of weather the storm and not get involved. And then it didn't really seem to have affected her book sales in the end that much. Whereas the people like Amelie Wen-Zhao and you mentioned Kosoko Jackson were much more involved in these spaces. And so, they stood to lose a lot of friends and a lot of professional contacts and things if this community turned against them. And, it almost makes it sound like, just as from a standpoint of self-preservation or like game theory or something, that the fewer contacts you have with the people who are calling people out, the less power that, or the sort of the less danger you're in, going forward.
Yeah. I mean, if you've never solicited the respect, or, the support of that side of the community, then it is probably no skin off your ass, or at least less skin, to be denounced by them. And even Lori Forrest, I have to say, she did what I think is the only thing you can do in a situation like this, where she simply didn't respond. She continued to engage with people who were interested in her book. She let this conversation just happen, without responding, without dignifying the vitriol. And even then, so she released her book and it did do well, but it took 2 years for instance, her Goodreads rating to rebound from the absolute just lashing that it took from people who hadn't read it, who were just, one-starring everything that she'd ever written because they wanted to hurt her career. So it's hard to say, you never know what would have happened if not for this. Would her book have been even more successful? Would she have been even more okay than she was? And it's, I think it could really torment you as a writer to start wondering what kind of opportunities you lost, because somebody decided to try to damage you in this way. But yeah, it's definitely true that there's this sort of live by the sword, die by the sword element. Once you decide to involve yourself in that aspect of the community, particularly in the calling out and the sniping and the backbiting and getting into Twitter spats about social justice, if somebody decides to come after you, it's, I think, much, much harder to just not respond or to disengage from that.
Mm-hmm. I listened to your interview with Anna Marie Cox, and, her position was sort of, that, diversity in publishing is an issue, which is definitely true. And that maybe this is just a necessary, overcorrection, or, it's sort of a period that we have to pass through in order to achieve a greater good. And, that may be true. I suspect actually this stuff is really counterproductive. But I guess it could go either way. But I thought that she was really minimizing how traumatic it is for authors to have hundreds of people saying you're an awful person on social media. I think maybe if you're a professional journalist, that's just kind of that's a typical day on Twitter. But I think that for authors who tend to be very sensitive and, insecure and impostor syndrome and all this kind of stuff, I think you really can't underestimate how awful this is for people.
Yeah, I don't think you even have to be particularly insecure to, to be traumatized by that. It is a traumatic thing to have, 100 people yelling at you that you're evil, that you're a bigot, that you're a racist, that you're hurting children. And the funny thing about that is that, if you say that you're upset by it, people are like, why are you taking this so personally? It's just criticism. All we're saying is that you're literally killing children. Why are you getting so upset? But, it's funny that you mentioned the Anna Marie Cox interview, which I actually recently re-listened to. And I realized it was one of the first times that I'd had a discussion with anybody on any podcast, period, but also talked with anybody about that article in a public way, and I was really freaked out and worried that I was going to put my foot in my mouth, and so I didn't push back against a lot of the stuff she said that I thought was actually really flat out wrong, or like you said, minimizing. To say that, it doesn't matter because maybe the book is, maybe the book just isn't that good anyway, so who cares? I think it just opens such a dangerous door, and it's weaselly in a way to start from this place of, well, we want to force edits on this book. We want you to censor your work because it's harmful, it's morally reprehensible, and then to pivot to, and it's not even that good. It's just, I think that that's something that happens a lot in these conversations that I wish people would stop doing.
Well, right. And there's been this sort of justification of like, oh no, but we made these criticisms and the author says, oh, thank you, and they're going to change the book now, and that's great. And I sort of have to wonder, like, well, if you had reached out to the author privately and said, it's your book, you can do what you want, but here's my perspective on it, like, what are the odds that the author would pull the book right before publication and change? It just seems, it's very hard for me to believe that that would ever happen.
Oh, it's ludicrous. It's so silly. It's so like, he loves Big Brother now. Of course, you say that. And I feel like people often in these conversations make references to like struggle sessions in China, which is obviously a pretty extreme thing to make a comparison to. But the idea that you are so grateful to the person who has savaged you, who's savaged your work, who's made it clear that they're going to impose serious reputational damage on you if you don't kowtow to their wishes. The fact that so many people are willing to kind of take that at face value, of course, they're truly grateful. I think that is really kind of, disingenuous.
Yeah. So that was just kind of my reaction to the Anna Marie Cox interview, was that, that the ends don't justify the means, and like bullying and harassment just as tactics, it's just morally wrong to employ those tactics, even if you have some greater good in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've talked about this so much with so many people at this point that I really think it's just become abundantly clear over the course of so many of these controversies that policing content is not the answer. You have to let writers write what they want to write. You've got to leave what's on the page alone. And, to improve diversity in publishing, let more people through the door. Let more and different types of writers in to tell more and different types of stories. And while you're at it, maybe diversify who's actually working in-house. Although to do that, you'd have to pay them a living wage. So good luck with that publishing. But the idea that we're going to solve this by policing what fictional characters are doing and saying within a work, I think is just incredibly wrong-headed, and it's clearly not the right way to go about things.
Do you think that she'll write any more articles on this topic, or are you kind of burned out on it?
Never say never. Although at this point, I feel like it's just the same thing happening over and over again. And so if something happens to kind of escalate, then I would definitely be interested in covering it. But I also really hope that doesn't happen. Like, I don't want things to get any worse on this front than they already are.
Yeah, all right. So I think that we're pretty much out of time, and I think we covered all the stuff I wanted to talk about. So do you have any final thoughts or any other projects you want to let people know about?
No, just want to reiterate that A Trick of Light is available as an Audible original and also in print from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, and would love for you to pick it up or read it or listen to it or do both. Why not?
Are you not working on a sequel to Trick of Light? There
is a sequel, yeah. We actually just had a creative meeting about it that I should shut up about. I don't even know why I'm talking about this. Shut up, Kat. But yes, there is going to be a second book. There's also going to be possibly a second Audible project that is different from the second book. But like I said, I should really shut up about this. The universe will continue to expand.
All right, yeah, well, definitely looking forward to that. And so we've been speaking with Kat Rosenfield about her new book, A Trick of Light. So, Kat, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Kat Rosenfield for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to James Gunther, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.